They shackled an 18-year-old girl to an anchor, leaving her to drown in the incoming storm surge. Her loyal German shepherd, beaten and broken, was tied just yards away, forced to watch his master die. The bullies laughed as they drove off, certain their secret would be swallowed by the sea. They thought no one would ever find them, but they didn't know a former Navy SEAL was staying in the cabin next door, and a race against the ocean had just begun. The town of Osprey Key, Florida, clung to the coastline like a stubborn barnacle. It was a place carved from salt and shadow, where the humid scent of mangrove forests mingled with the briny breath of the Gulf of Mexico. Old fishing boats bobbed in the marina, their paint peeled by a relentless sun. Meanwhile, on the sandy bluffs, the modern glass and steel villas of the newly rich looked down on the humble, salt-bleached cottages below. A quiet tension hung in the humid air, a constant tug-of-war between the town's gritty history and the glossy, profitable future promised by developers like Richard Sterling. Today, that tension was mirrored in the sky. The pale morning sun had surrendered early, retreating behind a wall of bruised purple clouds advancing from the horizon. The wind, once a playful whisper, now carried a mournful howl as it whipped through the sea oats, promising a storm of rare and violent beauty. On a secluded stretch of sand the locals called Galleon's Point, 18-year-old Clara Mae Thompson, a young woman with eyes the color of a stormy sea and hair like spun moonlight, was oblivious to anything but the spectacle before her. She knelt on the damp sand, a large professional camera in her hands. She moved with focused intensity, her lens capturing the raw power of the waves crashing against the black, jagged rocks that gave the cove its name. Beside her, Kaiser, a magnificent German shepherd with a coat of sable and black, rested his head on her lap, his intelligent amber eyes fixed on his owner. He was a silent, steadfast guardian, his calm presence a stark contrast to the churning sea. Clara wasn't just taking pictures, she was fighting. Each photograph was a piece of evidence, a testament to the wild, untamed beauty of this coastline. Her art was the heart of a conservation project she had started, a small but passionate campaign to stop the very bluffs she was documenting from being dynamited to make way for the soulless luxury of the Sterling Shores resort. The wind whipped a pale strand of her hair across her face, and she absently pushed it away. The project was consuming her, but it was a fight she had to win. This land, this cove, was woven into her family's heritage, a legacy of fishermen and artists who understood the language of the tides. To lose it would be to lose a part of herself. A few miles inland, nestled in a grove of ancient cypress trees, another soul watched the sky with a more practiced eye. Jack Callahan, a man whose easy smile couldn't quite hide the coiled power in his shoulders or the sharp intelligence in his dark eyes, stood on his uncle's porch. At 29, Jack was a former Navy SEAL, a man accustomed to decoding threats in shifting landscapes, be it a desert horizon or a turbulent sea. He was on a rare break from his new, quiet life, a few precious weeks to decompress from a world of noise and violence. He was patching the hull of an old skiff, the rhythmic scrape of sandpaper on wood a gentle meditation. But his focus kept drifting to the darkening sky. The clouds were moving too fast, their underbellies churning with a sickly green light he recognized. This wasn't just a squall. This was a monster. He had promised Clara he'd meet her at the docks after her photoshoot to help him test the skiff's new patch. He glanced at his watch, a flicker of concern crossing his face. She should have been back by now. He trusted her knowledge of the sea, but he also knew its treachery, and he knew how her stubborn passion could make her lose track of time. He was her family's oldest friend, the boy who had become a man, and then something more, something harder. To Clara, he was the closest thing she had to a brother, a steady anchor in her life. He decided to give her another 30 minutes. Then he would go looking for her. Back at Galleon's Point, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, fat and cold, splattering on Clara's camera bag. She sighed, carefully zipping it into its waterproof casing. "Come on, Kaiser," she said, her voice soft. The dog rose in a single fluid motion, shaking the sand from his coat. But before they could take a step, the crunch of tires on the gravel road behind them made them both turn. A gleaming black pickup truck, far too clean for the rough roads of Osprey Key, skidded to a halt. The driver's side door flew open and Trent Sterling vaulted out. He was the town's golden boy, the high school quarterback with a chiseled jaw and an easy confidence that bordered on arrogance. He wore his popularity like a crown, an inheritance of his father's wealth. Two others emerged from the truck. Cody, a wiry, dark-haired kid whose frayed jacket and anxious eyes suggested he was worlds away from Trent's privileged life, hung back, his discomfort palpable. And Madison, a girl with perfectly styled hair and a practiced smile, moved to stand beside Trent, her posture a clear declaration of her allegiance. Well, Trent began, his voice laced with patronizing charm. If it isn't the town's resident artist, saving the world one snapshot at a time. Clara stood her ground, her hand resting reassuringly on Kaiser's head. The dog didn't snarl, but a low rumble vibrated in his chest. I'm documenting what we stand to lose, Trent. Trent's smile tightened. What you're doing is getting in my father's way. That little speech you gave at the town hall meeting last week, you embarrassed him, you made him look like some corporate monster. Maybe he should stop acting like one, Clara retorted, her voice quiet but firm. The air grew tense. Trent took a step forward, his handsome features hardening into a mask of cold anger. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a girl he considered beneath him. You think you're so clever, he spat, hiding behind your pictures and your stupid dog. My father is bringing progress to this dying town. He's building something. What are you doing? You're clinging to a pile of rocks and some sentimental nonsense. Cody shifted his feet, looking from Trent to the menacing sky. Trent, maybe we should go. That storm. Shut up, Cody, Trent snapped without looking at him. His eyes were locked on Clara. You need to learn your place, Thompson. People like you don't get to decide the future. People like my dad do. He gestured around the deserted beach, the wind now whipping Madison's hair into a frenzy. This place is worthless. It's just sand and rock. And pretty soon that's all you'll have left to photograph. The rain was heavier now, slicking the rocks and turning the sand to a dark paste. The first distant clap of thunder rolled across the water. Clara didn't flinch. She just met his angry gaze with one of unwavering resolve. She was defending more than a piece of land. She was defending its soul. And that was a fight Trent Sterling, with all his father's money and power, would never understand. Her silence, her refusal to be intimidated, was the final spark. Trent's face twisted in a sudden, absolute rage. And in that moment, the storm on the horizon and the storm in his eyes became one. The thunder that followed wasn't a distant rumble. It was a violent crack that split the sky directly overhead, and in the white flash that bleached the world for a second, Clara saw the anger in Trent Sterling's eyes curdle into something chillingly decisive. His charm evaporated, leaving a raw, ugly core of entitlement. Grab her, he ordered, his voice sharp enough to cut through the rising shriek of the wind. Before Clara could react, Madison lunged, her manicured fingers digging into Clara's arm. Cody hesitated for a fatal second, his eyes wide with panic, but a venomous look from Trent sent him stumbling forward. He took Clara's other arm, his grip clumsy and apologetic. It was this moment of hesitation, the act of laying hands on his master, that Kaiser could not abide. The low growl in his chest erupted into a booming, protective roar. He launched himself forward, not at Trent, but at the arm holding Clara, a dark blur of loyalty and muscle. He didn't make it. Trent moved with the brutal, athletic grace of a quarterback. He sidestepped the dog's lunge and delivered a vicious, well-aimed kick with his heavy work boot to Kaiser's ribs. The sound was a sickening thud, followed by a yelp of pain that tore through Clara's heart. Kaiser, she screamed, struggling against the hands that held her. The dog collapsed onto the sand, whining, trying to scramble back to his feet. Trent was on him in an instant. He kicked again, and then again, his face a mask of cruel satisfaction. It was a punishment aimed not just at the dog, but at Clara, a demonstration of his power over everything she loved. Stop it. Please, Trent. Stop. Clara cried, her voice breaking. Cody finally spoke up, a panicked whisper. Trent, man. The dog didn't do anything. He challenged me, Trent snarled, panting, just like she did. He turned from the whimpering animal, his anger now seeking a new target. Get him to that driftwood log. He pointed to a large, gnarled log half buried in the sand at the base of the bluffs, well above the current tide line. Numb with shock, Cody and a visibly shaken Madison dragged the injured dog, now limping heavily, his tail tucked between his legs. Trent pulled a coil of thick nylon rope from the bed of his truck. He expertly looped it around Kaiser's neck and cinched it tight to the log. The dog let out a low, mournful whine, his amber eyes never leaving Clara. With Kaiser neutralized, Trent turned his full attention to Clara. His expression was now terrifyingly calm, the heat of his anger having cooled into something far worse, a cold, methodical purpose. Now you, he said, taking the rope and advancing on her. You love this beach so much, I think you should get to know it more intimately. He dragged her across the wet sand, away from the bluffs, toward the churning water's edge. There, half sunk in the soft sand, was a relic from the cove's past, a massive, rusted anchor, its flukes dug in deep. It was a permanent fixture, a landmark that had weathered a century of storms. Trent, no. Clara begged, the rain mingling with the tears on her cheeks. The chill of the wet sand was seeping through her jeans, a cold premonition of what was to come. He forced her to her knees beside the anchor's massive iron shank. Her struggles were useless against his strength. He worked quickly, his hands sure as he wrapped the rope around her wrists, binding them together. Then he looped the other end of the rope through the anchor's heavy eyelet and pulled it taut, cinching her to the immovable weight. The rope was coarse, and it bit into her skin, chafing her wrists raw. "See, Clara," he said, his voice a low taunt as he stood over her. "This is a lesson in perspective. The tide's coming in fast. In an hour, the water will be right here. In 2, it'll be over your head." He made a dismissive gesture. "The storm will wash everything away. Just another tragic accident. A stupid girl and her dog who got caught in a storm they should have known to avoid." Cody watched, his face ashen, his body trembling. "Trent, we can't do this," he stammered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "This is crazy. She could drown." Trent spun to face him, his eyes blazing. "Did I ask you, Cody? You want to end up like your deadbeat dad, working at the cannery for the rest of your life? Or do you want to stay on my good side, because you're on very thin ice right now?" He took a menacing step. "You will shut up. You will get in the truck, and you will forget this ever happened. Understood?" Cody flinched and nodded, all the fight draining out of him. He gave Clara one last look, his eyes a miserable mix of fear and shame before he turned away. Madison said nothing. She just stared at Clara, her expression a blank mask of shock before she, too, retreated to the safety of the truck. Trent gave the knot one last, vicious tug. "My father will own this entire coastline by spring," he said, his face close to hers, "and you'll be nothing but a ghost story they tell about the place." He turned and walked away without a backward glance, his form silhouetted for a moment against the raging storm before he climbed into the truck. The engine roared to life. The headlights cut 2 swaths of light through the downpour, sweeping over Clara and the injured, tethered form of Kaiser before the truck made a sharp U-turn and disappeared up the gravel road. And then there was only the sound. A sound filled with the roar of the wind, the crash of the waves, and the faint, desperate whine of a dog in pain. Clara was alone, bound to cold, unforgiving iron, with the hungry Gulf of Mexico creeping closer with every single wave. The rain fell like a curtain, washing out the world, leaving only her loyal friend, and the terrifying promise of the rising tide. The interior of Trent Sterling's truck was an island of insulated silence, a stark contrast to the chaos of nature raging outside. Rain hammered on the roof in a deafening, relentless drum solo. The wipers worked back and forth in a frantic, hypnotic rhythm, barely able to keep up with the deluge sluicing down the windshield. Lightning bleached the landscape white in strobing, instantaneous flashes, revealing a world of writhing trees and wind-whipped sea spray. Inside, the air was thick with unspoken horror. Madison sat pressed against the passenger door, her body rigid. She stared straight ahead, her gaze fixed on the fleeting patches of clarity the wipers provided, as if refusing to acknowledge the existence of the 2 boys beside her. She had her arms wrapped around herself, her knuckles white. She was a statue of appalled denial. Trent drove with a focused, almost casual intensity. One hand rested on the steering wheel, his knuckles slightly raw from the rope. A faint, self-satisfied smirk played on his lips. He had faced a challenge and crushed it. He had asserted his dominance. For him, the matter was over, a nuisance dealt with, a lesson taught. The storm was just weather. The rising tide was just nature, and what he had done was simply the natural order of things. But for Cody, squeezed between them, the silence was a roaring inferno. His mind wasn't in the truck. It was back on the beach, trapped in a nightmarish loop. He saw the flat, wet thud of Trent's boot connecting with Kaiser's side. He heard the dog's sharp, broken yelp of pain. He saw the look in Clara's eyes, not just of fear, but of a deep, soul-level betrayal. He could feel the phantom sensation of the coarse rope in his own hands, the guilt a physical thing, crawling on his skin. He had been Trent's accomplice for years. It was a simple transaction, loyalty for protection, a seat at the right table in the cafeteria, an escape from the pitying looks that followed a kid from the poor side of Osprey Key. He'd gone along with petty cruelties, laughed at unfunny jokes, and looked the other way more times than he could count. But this was different. This wasn't a prank. In 2, it'll be over your head. Trent's words echoed in his mind, stripping away the last flimsy shreds of denial. This was a death sentence. Trent hadn't just tied her up to scare her. He had tied her up to die. He had calculated the tide, the storm, the isolation. He had planned it, and they had helped him. The truck hit a deep puddle, sending a sheet of muddy water over the windshield and jolting Cody from his reverie. Through the blurred glass, he He could see the churning gray expanse of the Gulf. The waves were huge now, monstrous, their white caps visible even in the gloom. They were eating the beach. They were crawling toward the anchor. A wave of nausea rolled over him. He could picture the ice-cold water swirling around Clara's knees, then her waist. He could imagine her desperate, futile struggles against the unyielding iron and rope. He had to say something. The silence was suffocating him. "Trent," he began, his voice raspy. Trent didn't even look at him. "What? We gotta go back." The smirk on Trent's face vanished. "What did you just say?" "We have to go back for her," Cody repeated, a desperate urgency giving his voice strength. "That storm, the tide, Trent, she's going to die. We can't just leave her there. This isn't a joke." Trent let out a short, mirthless laugh. "Of course it's not a joke. It's a solution, and it's done. We are not going back." "You don't get it," Cody's voice rose, cracking with panic. "This is murder. They'll find out. We'll go to jail." At that, Madison finally flinched. She turned from the window, her eyes wide with a fear that was no longer just about Trent, but about the consequences Cody was laying bare. "He's right, Trent," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We should go back. We can untie her and leave. Say it was a joke that went too far." Trent slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded to a halt in the middle of the deserted, flooded road, its engine a low growl under the roar of the storm. He twisted in his seat, his body radiating a cold, dangerous energy. "Listen to me, both of you," he said, his voice dangerously low. "There is no we. There is me. I make the decisions. I solve the problems. She was a problem. And now," he said with a chilling finality, "she's not." He locked his eyes on Cody. "You've been riding my coattails since the 3rd grade, Cody. Don't you forget that. You do what I say." But Cody's fear of Trent was finally being eclipsed by the horror of what they had done. "Not this time," he said, shaking his head. "I'm not going to let someone die because of you. Stop the truck. I'm getting out. I'll go back myself." It was the last thing he should have said. Trent's movement was lightning fast. His arm shot out and his fist connected with Cody's jaw. The impact was stunning. A white-hot flash of pain sent Cody's head snapping back against the seat. Before he could recover, Trent was leaning over him, shoving the passenger door open, and with a guttural roar of fury, he pushed. Cody tumbled out of the truck, landing hard on the sharp gravel shoulder of the road. Pain flared in his side, and his head spun. He pushed himself up on his elbows, spitting out a mouthful of grit and rain just in time to see the truck door slam shut. Through the rain-streaked window, he saw Madison's horrified face for a split second before Trent stomped on the gas. The truck's tires spun, spraying mud and gravel, and then it shot forward, disappearing into the gray curtain of the storm. Cody was alone. He staggered to his feet, his jaw throbbing, a deep ache spreading through his ribs. The raw, untamed power of the storm hit him like a physical blow. The wind tore at his thin jacket, and the rain, driven sideways, pelted his face like needles. He was miles from town, miles from Galleon's Point. He was hurt, soaked to the bone, and utterly, desperately alone. Panic, cold and sharp, took hold. He couldn't get back to the beach on his own. He'd never make it in this weather. He couldn't go to the cops. Who would believe him against Trent Sterling? He stood there for a long moment, shaking uncontrollably, the world dissolving into a blur of rain and despair. And then, through the haze of pain and fear, a memory surfaced, an old cabin set back in the woods just off this road. A kind man with dark, watchful eyes who was a friend of the Thompsons. The SEAL, Jack Callahan. It was a desperate, grasping thought, a single pinprick of light in the overwhelming dark. He didn't know if the man was even there, but it was the only chance he had. The only chance Clara had. With a new, desperate purpose, Cody turned his back on the town and started to run, stumbling through the mud and the fury of the storm toward a cabin in the woods. Inside the cabin, the air was warm and smelled of cedar and brewing coffee. For Jack Callahan, it was a sanctuary, a quiet harbor from a life lived on the edge. But tonight, the sanctuary felt like a cage. He stood before the large picture window, watching the forest outside dissolve into a maelstrom of writhing branches and horizontal rain. The storm had arrived not as a guest, but as an invader. His unease had been a low hum all afternoon, a subtle dissonance in the quiet rhythm of his leave. Now it was a shrill, urgent alarm bell. He'd checked his watch a dozen times. Clara was late. Not just a little late, but worryingly, dangerously late. He knew her love for the wild power of the ocean, her tendency to lose herself in her art. But he also knew her respect for it. She would have seen this storm coming. She should have been back an hour ago. He had promised her parents, David and Helen, that he would keep an eye on her while he was in town. It was a promise made easily, a natural extension of the protective bond he had felt for her since she was a small, shy girl who had followed him around like a shadow one long ago summer. Now the weight of that promise settled in his gut. The coffee maker gurgled, its mundane sound an absurd counterpoint to the fury outside. He turned from the window, his decision made. He was pulling on his heavy, waterproof boots when the sound came. It wasn't a knock. It was a frantic, desperate pounding on the cabin's thick wooden door, a sound of pure panic almost swallowed by the howl of the wind. Jack moved instantly, crossing the room in 3 long strides. He threw the door open, and the storm lunged inside, carrying with it a figure that looked more like a ghost than a boy. It was Cody. He was soaked to the bone, his thin jacket plastered to his shivering frame. His face was a pale, bloodless mask, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to have stolen his breath. A raw, ugly bruise was already starting to form along his jaw, and he was clutching his side, his breath coming in short, painful gasps. "Cody, what the hell happened to you? Where's Clara?" Jack's voice was calm, but a cold dread was coiling in his stomach. Cody stumbled over the threshold, collapsing against the doorframe. He tried to speak, but his words were a jumbled, shivering mess, his teeth chattering with cold and shock. He looked up at Jack, and in his eyes, Jack saw the reflection of a horror he knew all too well, the look of a man who has witnessed the unforgivable. Trent, Cody gasped, pointing a trembling finger out into the storm. "Galleon's Point. He left her." Jack gripped the boy's shoulders, his hold firm but steady, forcing Cody to focus. "Slow down. Tell me." "He tied her," Cody finally sobbed, the words spilling out in a torrent of guilt and fear. "He tied her to the anchor. The tide, man. The tide's coming in. A beat. And Kaiser. He hurt Kaiser." The boy's confession dissolved into a raw, ragged cry, the sound of a soul breaking apart. In that instant, the quiet man on leave vanished. The easygoing friend was gone. The change was silent, instantaneous, and total. In his place stood the operator. Jack's mind became a place of absolute clarity. There was no room for anger, no time for the question of why. There was only the mission. Clara, bound, rising tide, hostile environment. All other information was irrelevant. He dragged Cody inside and kicked the door shut against the storm. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice flat, stripped of all emotion. He moved with a disciplined, explosive energy. He strode to a large steel footlocker in the corner of the room, a piece of his other life that had followed him here. He unlocked it. Inside, nestled in custom foam, were not the belongings of a man on vacation. First, he pulled out a compact go bag. The red cross on its front marked it as a field trauma kit containing everything needed to treat injuries far more severe than a bruised jaw. He threw it on the table. Next, a flashlight. It was matte black, heavy and solid, a tactical light with a focused beam that could cut through darkness and water like a laser. Then came a coil of repelling rope, thin but impossibly strong, and a harness with carabiners that clinked softly as he set them out. Finally, he retrieved a sheath from which he drew a dive knife. It wasn't a weapon for fighting. It was a tool for survival. Its spine was serrated and its razor-sharp blade was forged to cut through rope, nets, and entanglements in the unforgiving deep. It was a blade designed to sever bonds. He strapped the knife to his calf and slung the rope and harness over his shoulder. He grabbed the flashlight and the med kit. The entire process took less than 20 seconds. He turned back to Cody, who was huddled by the fire, shivering, his face in his hands. The operator's eyes assessed him in a flash. Shock, early stage hypothermia, minor blunt force trauma. He could be dealt with later. "Get up," Jack ordered. The tone was not a request. It was a command, absolute and unbreakable. The kind of voice that made men move without thinking. Cody looked up, startled, his eyes wide and confused. "I don't have time for your fear right now," Jack said, his voice like flint. "I need your eyes. You're coming with me. You're going to show me the way. Now." He grabbed Cody's arm and pulled him to his feet. The boy stumbled, but the force of Jack's will seemed to hold him upright. Jack threw a heavy oilskin coat over Cody's trembling shoulders. He opened the door again, and the storm roared its challenge. Jack didn't even flinch. He just stared into the screaming dark, his focus already miles away on a deserted beach where the girl he had sworn to protect was being consumed by the sea. He pushed Cody out onto the porch ahead of him, into the teeth of the gale. The rescue had begun. The old 4x4 truck roared, a beast of steel and grit battling a god of wind and water. Inside, Jack drove with a stillness that was a complete contradiction to the chaos outside. His hands were steady on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the narrow cone of mud and swirling water illuminated by the headlights. He wasn't fighting the storm, he was navigating it, every movement economical and precise, threading a needle through the heart of a hurricane. Beside him, Cody was a shivering wreck. The oilskin coat Jack had thrown over him did nothing for the chill that had settled deep in his bones, a cold born of guilt and terror. He gripped the dashboard with white knuckles, his body lurching with every bump and slide. Each flash of lightning revealed a world gone mad, a landscape of tortured trees and horizontal rain. And with every flash, he saw Clara's face, her eyes wide, the coarse rope biting into her wrists. "The road gets worse up ahead," Cody stammered, his voice a thin thread against the roar of the engine and the storm. "It narrows. The bluff's edge is right there." "I see it," Jack replied, his voice low, calm, somehow more commanding than a shout. He didn't look at Cody. His focus was absolute, his senses processing the fire hose of information from outside, the sound of gravel grinding under the tires, the feel of the truck threatening to hydroplane, and the sight of a new obstacle appearing in the headlights. It was a massive cypress tree, a giant of the forest, now lying prone across the road. Its ancient roots were torn from the earth, a gaping wound in the hillside, and its colossal trunk completely blocked their path. There was no way around it. Jack brought the truck to a controlled stop just feet from the barricade of splintered wood and tangled branches. He cut the engine. In the sudden, relative silence, the shriek of the wind sounded even more malevolent. "This is as far as the truck goes," he said, already unbuckling his seatbelt. "How far is the point on foot?" "About half a mile," Cody said, his heart sinking. "But the trail, it'll be all mud. It's dangerous." "Everything's dangerous right now," Jack said simply. He was already out of the truck, the wind tearing at him, the harness and rope slung over his shoulder. "We move now." For Clara, time had dissolved into a brutal rhythm of pain, cold, and the relentless crash of waves. The water was at her waist now, a living, impossibly cold entity. It stole her breath, leached the strength from her limbs, and promised a slow, numbing end. Each wave was a violent shove, slamming her against the unforgiving iron of the anchor, forcing the air from her lungs. She had stopped screaming for help long ago. Her voice was just a raw whisper lost in the symphony of the storm. Her focus had narrowed to a single, desperate task. In the sand near her knees, she had found it, a half-shattered conch shell, its broken edge sharp as a piece of obsidian. She had managed to work her bound hands around to her front, and now with clumsy, nearly numb fingers, she was sawing at the thick nylon rope. The motion was agonizing. The sharp shell bit into her frozen skin as often as it bit into the rope, but she barely felt it. All she felt was the cold, scraping, sawing progress. It was maddeningly slow, a tiny act of defiance against the overwhelming power of the ocean. A few of the rope's fibers had frayed. It was a pathetic victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. It was hope. She glanced over her shoulder toward the bluffs. Kaiser was a dark, huddled shape against the pale, rain-soaked driftwood, nearly invisible. He wasn't whining anymore. He was silent, his head low. A wave of despair colder than the water washed over her. Was he even breathing? "Hang on, Kaiser," she whispered, her words a puff of vapor in the frigid air. "I'm coming. I'm coming for you." The sound of his name, her promise, seemed to stir him. He lifted his head for a moment, and a faint, low moan reached her ears. He was alive. That knowledge was a jolt of adrenaline, a fire in her frozen veins. She attacked the rope with a renewed ferocity, ignoring the pain, ignoring the cold, ignoring the rising water that was now crawling up her ribs. She would not die here. She would not let him die here. The journey along the bluff trail was a waking nightmare. The path had turned into a treacherous, slick river of mud. The wind, funneled by the bluffs, threatened to tear them from their footing and hurl them into the roiling chaos below. Jack moved with the sure-footed grace of a mountain goat, his body low, using his hands for balance. He half-dragged, half-carried Cody, who slipped and stumbled, his city sneakers useless in the mire. "Stay low. Watch your feet," Jack yelled over the storm. Cody could only nod, his mind a fog of terror. This was a world he didn't understand, a place of primal violence where people like him were helpless. But Jack seemed to belong here. He moved through the storm not as a victim, but as an equal opponent, a force of nature in his own right. They rounded a sharp bend, and the full, horrifying vista of Galleon's Point opened up below them. Cody gasped, his hand flying to his mouth. The beach he remembered was gone, swallowed by a churning cauldron of gray, white-capped waves. The water was well past the anchor, swirling high around a small, desperate figure. Even from this distance, he could see Clara's pale hair, her body being battered by the surf. Further up the beach, Kaiser was a dark lump, nearly reached by the highest of the waves. They were out of time. The tide wasn't just rising. It was surging, driven into a frenzy by the hurricane-force winds. Jack saw it all in a single, sweeping glance. His face, already a mask of grim focus, hardened into granite. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The scene below was a ticking clock, and its last seconds were slipping away. He plunged down the final stretch of trail in a controlled, dangerous slide, his destination already clear, a rocky outcropping that overlooked the spot where Clara was tied. It was the only viable anchor point. He was no longer just a man on a rescue mission. He was a promise made years ago to a little girl under a summer sun, now being kept in the heart of a winter storm. And he would not fail. There was no more time. The words weren't spoken, but they were the only reality that existed on the edge of the bluff. They were in the shriek of the wind, the snarl of the ocean, the fragile, guttering life of the girl in the waves below. Jack wasted not a single second assessing the washed-out trail. It was gone. An obstacle, nothing more. His eyes scanned the rocky ground and found what he was looking for, a thick granite boulder sunk deep into the earth, a solid anchor against the storm's fury. He moved in a series of fluid, economical motions, his body a testament to years of training where hesitation meant death. The harness was on, the carabiner clipped, the rope secured around the boulder with a knot that could hold a truck. He turned to Cody, who was staring down at the scene below, his face a mask of absolute horror. "Cody." Jack's voice was a knife's edge that cut through the boy's paralysis. "Listen to me. I need you." Cody's head snapped up, his eyes wide and terrified. "This rope," Jack said, pressing the thick coil into Cody's trembling hands. "Brace yourself against the rock behind me. Lean back. Your job is to be the anchor. Don't pull. Don't let go. Just hold. Can you do that?" It wasn't just a question. It was a transfer of responsibility, a sliver of purpose offered to a boy drowning in his own guilt. Cody looked at the rope, then into Jack's unwavering eyes, and a spark of resolve ignited in him. He nodded, his jaw tight. "Yeah. I can do that." "Good man," Jack said, and it was the first sign of warmth he had shown. He gave Cody's shoulder a single, hard squeeze, then turned, backed himself to the edge of the cliff, and without a flicker of hesitation, he was gone. Clara's world had shrunk to the burning pain in her wrists and the crushing weight of the water. The sea was a violent predator, relentlessly trying to drag her under. The sawing with the broken shell had become a weak, mechanical motion, her fingers too numb to feel the cuts anymore. Hope was a dying ember, and a strange, peaceful numbness was starting to creep into the edges of her consciousness. It would be so easy to stop. A traitorous voice whispered. "Just let the water take it. It will be warm. It will be quiet." And then, through the gray curtain of rain and spray, she saw him. A dark figure against the stormy sky, coming down the cliff face. For a moment she thought her mind was breaking, that the cold was conjuring ghosts. It was a dream, a hallucination born of desperation, a phantom in the storm. But the figure kept coming, moving with impossible speed and sureness, a spider on a thread in the heart of the gale, and as he neared the bottom of the bluff, a flash of lightning illuminated his face, and her heart stopped. It wasn't a ghost. It was Jack. His appearance was so sudden, so profound, it shattered the encroaching apathy. A choked, ragged sob escaped her lips. He was real. He was here. The rappel was a controlled fall through chaos. The wind slammed Jack against the slick rock face and sheets of ice-cold spray blinded him, but he moved on instinct, his feet finding purchase on impossibly sheer surfaces, his hands expertly guiding his descent. He hit the churning waves at the base of the bluff and unclipped from the line in one smooth motion. The water was a physical shock, a brutal, paralyzing cold that tried to steal the air from his lungs. He ignored it. He was already moving, wading through the powerful surge toward the anchor. He saw Clara's face, her lips blue, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and dawning hope. He also saw the wave. It was a liquid mountain, a black, rolling wall of water building behind her, its crest frothing with rage. It was a killer wave, the kind the storm had been building for hours. "Hold your breath," he roared, lunging forward. He reached her just as the wave broke. The world became a deafening, crushing maelstrom of white water and immense pressure. It tried to tear him away, to rip her from the anchor, but Jack planted his feet, turning his body into a breakwater, taking the full, brutal impact on his back and shoulders. For a moment, they were completely submerged, caught in the violent undertow. Then the wave receded, and they could breathe again. Clara was coughing, choking, but she was still there. Jack wasted no time. The dive knife was already in his hand, its serrated blade gleaming. He sawed through the thick, waterlogged nylon binding her wrists with a single powerful, upward slash. The rope parted with a flat, wet snap. She was free from the anchor, but they weren't safe yet. He grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the iron death trap. "Kaiser!" she gasped, pointing with a trembling hand. Jack saw the dog, nearly engulfed by the last wave, struggling weakly. He was moving again, half swimming, half wading through the treacherous water. He reached the driftwood log and, with another quick, brutal cut, severed the rope around Kaiser's neck. That's when he heard it, a sound more terrifying than the storm. A deep, grinding groan from the cliff above, the sound of stressed rock giving way. He looked up. A huge section of the bluff, the very outcropping where the washed-out trail had been, was peeling away from the rock face. The anchor where Clara had been tied seconds before lay directly beneath it. He didn't think, he acted. "Get down!" he yelled, and he launched himself at Clara, driving her down onto the sand and covering her body with his own. The world exploded in a cataclysm of grinding rock and shattering earth. The bluff collapsed, sending tons of mud and stone cascading onto the beach. A boulder the size of his truck landed squarely where the anchor had been, burying it completely. Smaller rocks and debris rained down around them, striking Jack's back and shoulders like shrapnel. A sharp, searing pain shot through his left arm as a jagged piece of rock gashed him. But he didn't move. His body was a shield, his hands clamped over Clara's head until the landslide subsided. For a moment there was silence, and then the roar of the storm rushed back in. Jack pushed himself up, hissing in pain. His arm was bleeding freely, a deep gash just below the shoulder. He ignored it. He looked at Clara. She was terrified but unhurt. He checked on Kaiser. The dog was stunned but alive. "We're going," he said, his voice strained. He grabbed his rope, still dangling from above, and gave it 3 sharp tugs. The signal. He worked with grim efficiency, his movement slightly hampered by the injured arm. He looped a section of rope around Kaiser's chest, securing the injured animal. Then he fashioned a hasty harness for Clara, clipping her directly to his own. "Hold on to me," he commanded. He looked up toward the edge of the bluff, a small, desperate figure against the sky. "Cody, pull!" he bellowed, his voice carrying over the wind. And the rope went taut. The half-mile journey from the bluff trail back to the truck was a new kind of hell. It was a brutal, agonizing uphill climb through sucking mud and driving rain, a test of will against the fading light. Jack was operating on pure, cold instinct. His injured arm was a burning agony, a dead weight that threatened his balance, but he locked the pain away. It was just data. The mission was all that mattered. He kept Clara secure against his chest, her small, cold body sheltered by his larger frame. She was lapsing into semi-consciousness, her shivers so violent they seemed to shake him as well. Cody, galvanized by Jack's earlier command, had found a reserve of strength. He half-carried, half-dragged Kaiser's limp form, his face a mask of grim determination, tears and rain mixing on his cheeks. They reached the truck and Jack all but threw them inside. He started the engine, the motor screaming as he cranked the heater to full blast. The small cab was instantly filled with the roar of the fan, an artificial pocket of warmth in a world of ice. The drive back to the cabin was a blur of grinding gears and sliding tires. When they finally burst through the cabin door, Jack didn't bother with the lights. On the floor, in front of the fireplace, he commanded, his voice raw. He laid Clara down on the thick bearskin rug as Cody gently placed Kaiser beside her. The contrast between the storm's fury and the sudden, warm stillness of the cabin was jarring. Clara was in a bad way. Her lips were a frightening shade of blue. Her skin was waxy and pale, the shudders racking her body were uncontrollable, a desperate, failing attempt by her body to generate heat. Jack's training took over completely. He was no longer Jack, the friend. He was the operator, the field medic. "Cody," he snapped, and the boy flinched. "I need you. Focus. Get those blankets. All of them, and that sleeping bag. Now." As Cody scrambled to obey, Jack knelt beside Clara. His dive knife, still in hand, sliced through her wet clothes, the jacket, the flannel shirt, the jeans, in a series of quick, impersonal cuts. This wasn't about modesty. It was about survival. Wet clothing was a death sentence. He cut away the fabric, leaving her in her underthings, and immediately began piling the dry blankets Cody threw him on top of her. He shifted his attention to Kaiser. The dog was taking shallow, ragged breaths. His ribs were clearly broken, his body limp with shock and cold. Jack ran his hands over the dog's coat, his touch surprisingly gentle. He draped his own oilskin coat over the animal, tucking it in tight. Clara's shivering was getting worse. "Cody, the fire. I need it roaring now. Use the kindling and the rest of the wood." Jack grabbed the med kit he'd left on the table. He ignored the deep, throbbing gash in his own arm, the wound now soaking his sleeve with a spreading dark stain. He pulled out chemical heat packs, cracked them to activate them, and began shoving them under the blankets, placing them at Clara's neck, armpits, and groin, the critical points for warming the blood. "Cody, get over here." The boy, having stoked the fire until it blazed, crawled over, his eyes wide. "I need you to rub her feet and hands, hard. We have to force the circulation." Cody hesitated, looking at Clara's pale, motionless form.
I helped do this," he whispered, his voice breaking.
"Then help fix it," Jack said, his voice hard as steel. "Grieve later. Work now." Cody nodded, his shame giving way to purpose, and he began chafing her frozen hands, his movements desperate and rough. Miles away, the black truck skidded to a stop in front of a pristine two-story home in the wealthiest part of Osprey Key. The storm seemed different here, somehow tamed by manicured lawns and expensive architecture. "Get out," Trent said. Madison stared at him, her mind a screaming blank. "Get out," he repeated, his voice dangerously low. "You weren't at the beach. You were never with us. We went to a movie and I dropped you home. Cody stole my truck and went crazy. You understand?" Madison stared at the dashboard, her entire body shaking. You could have killed them." Trent grabbed her chin, his fingers digging in, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were as cold and dead as the sea in the storm. "You say one word, Madison, and I will make you regret it more than Cody does. You hear me? Your dad's job at my dad's bank will be gone. Your reputation will be gone. You'll be nothing." He released her, and she stumbled out of the truck, collapsing onto the wet pavement. The truck sped away, leaving her in the rain. She stayed there for a long time, the cold water soaking through her designer jeans, but she felt nothing. The social ladder she had spent her life trying to climb had collapsed beneath her, revealing a deep, black pit. She had watched. She had been silent. That silence was now screaming in her ears, louder than the thunder. It was the sound of Kaiser's yelp, the image of Clara's pale, terrified face. With a choked sob, she scrambled to her feet. But she didn't go into her warm, safe house. She ran to her own car, a small, practical sedan parked in the driveway. Her hands were shaking so badly it took her 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. She wasn't going to the police, she was too scared, but she couldn't live with the silence. She drove, her vision blurred by tears, through the flooded streets, out of the safety of her neighborhood and toward the old, winding road that led to the Thompson farm. The farmhouse was a beacon in the dark woods. As Madison's headlights swept across the porch, the front door opened. Helen Thompson, a woman with a warm, flour-dusted apron and the same sea-gray eyes as Clara, stepped out. Her smile was one of gentle concern. "Madison, honey, what are you doing out here? You look frozen." Behind her, David Thompson appeared. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face weathered from a lifetime fishing the North Gulf. He was the family's quiet, solid core, and his eyes, sharp and discerning, missed nothing. He saw the girl's terror, her expensive clothes soaked and mud-stained. This was not a social call. Madison crumpled onto the bottom step, the words tumbling out of her in a guilty torrent. "Mr. Thompson. Mrs. Thompson, it's Clara." Helen's hand flew to her mouth. David went suddenly rigid. "We were at Galleon's Point," Madison sobbed. "Trent, he was so angry. He hurt Kaiser and he tied Clara to the anchor. The big one. And the tide. Oh, God. The tide was coming in. We left her. We just left her there." The world stopped. For a second, the only sound was the rain drumming on the porch roof. Helen let out a single, strangled cry. David's normally calm face contorted, and a low, terrible sound rumbled in his chest. The coffee mug he was holding slipped from his fingers and shattered on the wooden planks. "He what?" David's voice was a whisper more frightening than any shout.
I don't know if she's..."
Madison couldn't finish. Helen, her face ashen, grabbed her husband's arm, her mind racing. "David, Jack's back. He's at his uncle's cabin. It's the closest place to the point. If Clara got away, if anyone." David didn't need to hear another word. He was already moving, grabbing a heavy-duty flashlight and his keys. He looked down at the sobbing girl on his porch. "Get in the truck," he commanded, his voice flat and deadly. "You're coming with us." Back at the cabin, the frantic energy had settled into a grim, desperate watch. Clara's shivers had subsided, replaced by a deep, unnatural stillness, but her skin was warmer to the touch. Kaiser was breathing, his tail giving a weak thump every time Cody whispered his name. Jack, finally satisfied that they were both stable for the moment, leaned against the wall. The pain in his arm, now that the adrenaline had worn off, was a throbbing, searing agony. He tore open the med kit, his good hand fumbling with a tourniquet and a pressure bandage. That's when a new sound hit the door. Jack was on his feet in an instant, the dive knife in his hand, his body automatically shifting into a defensive posture. He motioned for Cody to be silent. He moved to the door, his shadow long in the firelight. He pulled it open, ready for a threat. Instead, he saw David and Helen Thompson, their faces masks of pure, unadulterated horror. And behind them, cowering, was Madison. Helen's eyes shot past him into the warm, firelit room. She saw the small, blanket-wrapped form on the floor. "Clara!" she cried, and she pushed past Jack, collapsing onto the rug beside her daughter. "Oh, my baby. She's breathing. David, she's breathing." David Thompson stood frozen in the doorway, his gaze sweeping over the scene, a story clicking into place with horrifying clarity. He saw his daughter, alive, but pale as death. He saw the crying accomplice, Madison, on his porch. He saw the other one, Cody, huddled by the fire, bruised and miserable. And then he saw Jack. He saw the man who had been a boy on his fishing boat, the friend his daughter adored. He saw the blood soaking his sleeve, the combat bandage he was struggling to apply one-handed, the exhaustion carved deep into his face. He saw the raw rope burns on his daughter's wrists as Helen gently moved a blanket. A universe of gratitude, rage, and profound relief passed between the two men. David, a man of few words, stepped inside, pulling Madison in with him and slamming the door against the storm. He walked to Jack, his expression unreadable. He offered no thanks. Not yet. He just pointed to the gash in Jack's arm. "You saved my girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Now, let me save you." He took the bandage from Jack's fumbling hand. "Helen, get some hot water. And you, boy," he nodded at Cody. "More coffee. Strong. It's gonna be a long night." Jack finally let his shoulders slump, the weight of the world settling on him. He nodded, the operator finally receding, leaving the tired, injured man behind. "Thanks, David." Dawn broke, pale and bruised, on a ravaged landscape. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and dripping wet. Inside the cabin, a fragile peace reigned. The fire crackled, a warm, beating heart in the quiet room. Clara was awake, propped up on the sofa, wrapped in a cocoon of blankets. Color had returned to her cheeks, though a deep exhaustion still shadowed her sea-gray eyes. Helen sat beside her, gently dabbing antiseptic on the raw, red lines the ropes had left around her wrists. Across the room, David Thompson, his face a stoic mask, finished tying a clean, tight combat dressing around Jack's injured arm. The fisherman's hands, accustomed to mending nets, were surprisingly deft. Jack sat still, accepting the help, though his gaze remained fixed on Clara. The operator was gone, and the friend, tired and aching, remained. Cody and Madison were huddled in armchairs, speaking in low, hushed tones, the shared trauma having forged a strange, fragile bond between them. Kaiser lay on the bearskin rug, his tail giving a gentle thump whenever Clara said his name. He was bruised, but, thanks to Jack's care, stable. It was the sound of an engine, a low rumble that vibrated through the cabin's floorboards, that shattered the quiet. Not one vehicle, but two. David moved to the window, his broad shoulders tense. "Sheriff's patrol car," he said, his voice flat. "And the Sterling's SUV." Jack rose in a single, deliberate movement. The pain in his arm was a dull, persistent throb, but he pushed it aside. He looked at Cody and Madison, who had both gone rigid with fear. "Stay here. Don't say anything until I do." Then he met David's eyes, and a silent understanding passed between them. The cabin door opened before anyone could knock. Sheriff Miller was a man who looked as though he had been poured into his uniform and had settled comfortably over the years. His face was fleshy and pink, and he carried the easy authority of someone who hadn't been seriously challenged in a long time. He was a man, it was said, who liked to keep the peace by not rocking the boat, especially when that boat belonged to the richest man in the county. Behind him was Richard Sterling, the picture of sleek, predatory power. He wore a tailored cashmere coat over an expensive suit, looking both completely out of place and utterly in control. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his eyes, cold and calculating, swept the room, assessing threats and weaknesses. Hiding behind him, looking pale and defiant, was his son, Trent. "David, Helen," the sheriff began, his voice a practiced blend of concern and officialdom. "Glad to see everyone's safe. We're here about a pretty serious incident." Richard Sterling stepped forward, his presence immediately dominating the small space. "Let's not waste time, Sheriff. My son's truck was stolen last night. This young man," he said, pointing a rigid finger at Cody, "assaulted my son, took his vehicle, and apparently dragged Miss Foster here along for a joyride that went terribly wrong." Cody shrank back, shaking his head, but he obeyed Jack and remained silent. "According to my son," Richard continued, his voice smooth as oiled steel, "he found them later, trying to cover their tracks after Miss Thompson here had some kind of accident near the water. Trent, being a responsible young man, was trying to help when this person," he gestured at Jack, "intervened. It was a masterful lie constructed to protect his son and shift all blame." He was painting a picture of juvenile delinquency with Trent as the unfortunate hero. Sheriff Miller nodded, turning to Cody. "Son, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me. We need to get your statement down at the station." It wasn't a request, but before he could take a step, Jack moved, placing himself between the sheriff and the terrified boy. He didn't raise his voice. He made no threat. He simply existed, a wall of calm, controlled strength. "That's not going to happen, Sheriff," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying a note of absolute finality. The sheriff blinked, taken aback. "And who are you?" "My name is Petty Officer First Class Jack Callahan, United States Navy," Jack stated, his posture shifting, his title hanging in the air with a tangible weight. "This cabin is my temporary residence, and everyone in this room, except for you and the Sterlings, is under my protection." The dynamic in the room had changed. This was no longer just a local matter. Richard Sterling scoffed. "A sailor? This is a civilian matter and it has nothing to do with." "It has everything to do with me," Jack cut in, his dark eyes locking on Richard. He began to speak, his voice a low, clinical narration of events, like a mission debrief. "At approximately 1,700 hours yesterday, Trent Sterling, with the assistance of Cody and Madison, assaulted Clara Mae Thompson and her service animal, Kaiser." He gestured to the dog. "The animal's injuries include blunt force trauma to the ribs and subsequent hypothermia." He then gestured to Clara. He then bound Miss Thompson to a fixed anchor below the storm tide line with the clear and stated intent of causing her death by drowning. Evidence for this includes the rope burns on her wrists, which Mrs. Thompson has photographed, and her severe hypothermic state upon rescue. He paused, letting the words sink in. "I was injured in the process of rescuing Miss Thompson from a rockslide caused by storm erosion. A rockslide that would have killed her had she remained tied to that anchor." He touched the fresh dressing on his arm. "And finally," he said, looking at Cody and Madison, "we have the testimony of 2 eyewitnesses who will corroborate every detail of Trent Sterling's actions." David and Helen moved to stand behind Cody and Madison, a silent, unmovable wall of support. Richard's composure finally cracked. "This is absurd. It's the word of 2 scared, delinquent kids against my son," he roared, turning on the sheriff. "Miller, do your job. Arrest this boy now." The sheriff, now looking profoundly uncomfortable, took a hesitant step forward. "Sheriff," Jack said, his voice dropping lower, becoming as cold and dangerous as the ocean at midnight, "I advise you to think very carefully about your next move." He took a small step forward, invading the sheriff's space. "Attempted murder is a felony. Filing a false police report and witness tampering are also felonies, but what you are about to do is called obstruction of justice." He let that hang in the air for a moment. "And when the victim of that obstruction is a federal officer, and yes, as an active duty Navy SEAL, that is what I am, it stops being a local matter." He leaned in, his voice a whisper that was somehow louder than all the shouting. "If you put a hand on that boy, my next call is to the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS. They have a field office in Pensacola. They'll be here by afternoon, and I can assure you they take a very, very dim view of small-town politics interfering in a federal case, especially when it involves one of their own." The threat was a tactical nuclear bomb in the small cabin. NCIS, Federal Investigation. Richard Sterling's power, which was absolute in Osprey Key, meant nothing against that. Sheriff Miller froze, his hand dropping away from his sidearm. He looked from Jack's stone-cold face to Richard's suddenly pale one. The boat he had tried so hard not to rock had just been capsized by a battleship. It was Trent who broke. The arrogant facade built on a lifetime of his father's power crumbled to dust. He looked at Clara, her face pale but her gaze strong and unbroken. He looked at the immovable presence of Jack. He looked at his father, whose power had just evaporated. "Dad, he stammered, his voice the whine of a little boy. "I didn't mean to. I was just trying to scare her." It was a confession, and in the ringing silence that followed, everyone knew the game was over. Weeks later, the last rays of an autumn sun cast long shadows across the Thompsons' porch. The Sterling Shores Resort was a dead project, buried under the weight of a federal investigation and public outrage. Richard Sterling was fighting to save his reputation and his fortune. Trent was facing juvenile court, his future a dim, uncertain road. Jack, his leave extended, sat on the porch steps watching Clara sketch. Her subject was Kaiser, who was sprawled in a patch of sun, a faint scar visible on his side, but otherwise fully recovered. Clara's wrists still showed faint pink lines, but her hands were steady, her eyes clear. "They say Cody and Madison are starting a new climate program at the school," she said, not looking up from her pad. "Trying to make things better." "Good for them," Jack said. He had a fresh, clean dressing on his arm, but the wound was healing. She finally looked at him, a small, grateful smile touching her lips. "You know, for a guy who deals with storms for a living, you have a habit of showing up right when they hit." Jack returned her smile, a genuine warmth in his eyes. "Someone has too," he said, looking out at the calm, blue expanse of the Gulf. "That's what anchors do."